Welcome, class, to lecture number 7. Um, and we're going to try to take a second and situate, again, all the learning that we've been sort of throwing at you um, into, again, a broader perspective of why we study minority relationships here in America. So, part of our goal is to get a look at what does power look like when one group controls the culture, the law, the politics, the education, the government, and how can that be used um, against groups um, that don't have that power? So we're going to talk in a second about a book called The Mismeasure of Man by Stephen Gould. And we're going to see how indigenous people, African Americans, Asian people, uh, anybody with physical issues or IQ issues, played into something called the eugenics movement, and specifically how the dominant group used their power to hurt and disadvantage those groups. So let's take a look at something out of the realm of race or gender right now. So we don't really think about it, but most folks in America are right-handed. But every year, 2,500 people are killed that are left-handed by using a right-handed designed tool or implement. Now, we don't think that right-handed people are today out to get left-handed people, but with the neglect and the idea of that majority passive ignoring that there are differences between left-handed and right-handed people, left-handed, right-handed desks, that majority can actually end up having a detrimental effect. And we see that actually historically being left-handed, school systems would try to beat or change or train that out of students, that they were considered bad or somehow defective because they were left-hand dominated versus right-hand dominated. So I bring that up as an example of when people hear these things, they go, oh, you're trying to make us feel bad and I didn't do anything to anybody. Well, now that you have this education, though, it does become part of what you need to do to address the systemic problems and acknowledge the systemic problems that groups face. So let's go back to the mismeasure of man, and we find at the beginning of the chapters. Again, this is not an assigned book. We're just going to know what you get from this lecture. There are these drawings that were used to try to exaggerate the difference and thus the inferiority of groups like Native Americans and African Americans. For instance, Thomas Jefferson and other scholars of his age believed that Africans were just inferior. And that wasn't by accident. There's a certain amount of cultural propaganda. There's a great book called Black Athena by a guy named Bernal, in which he posits that it was actually very much a plot to change people's opinions, that to diminish Africa, despite the fact that they had this huge problem, and it was called a pyramid. And actually, there were several of them. And they didn't know how the pyramids were built. And at the time, in the 1600s, they had to figure out a way that the largest things ever built by human beings were built by Africans who Europeans considered to be inferior, yet they hadn't figured out a way to do this pyramid thing. It's still with us today. Was it 40%, I believe, of Gen Z and millennials believe that UFOs had something to do with the design and implementation of the pyramids. Now, we can laugh about that, but do you see that there's also a racism there? That white people, Western culture, have the idea first in a belief not that African people on the continent of Africa, Egyptians, could build the pyramids. No, they had to have some sort of supernatural alien interference. So, in the book Black Athena, a different book, again, by a guy named Bernal, he looks at this and he's saying, it was basically part of a Western view, if you will, a conspiracy by those folks to diminish anybody, Asians, Africans, anybody that was not white European. So how did they do it? Well, when we look to this book, The Mismeasure of Man, we find something called craniometry. This is measuring the skull size. The idea being the bigger your skull, the bigger your brain, the smarter you are. Now, we've later, of course, defined that that's just nonsense. But at the time, big-headed Northern Europeans loved this theory because they happen to have really big skulls. So a guy named Morton and another guy named Paul Broca really dig into this idea, and they decide that the difference in brain and cranium size definitely means inferiority. Even Montessori, the development of Montessori schools, looked into this and again believed in the idea that somehow there were real racial and IQ or intelligence differences. This eventually leads to a guy named Cesare Lombroso saying that certain groups, ethnic groups, the Irish, Italians, whoever, had an innate criminality to them. And this begins the development of something called eugenics. Again, this is a science, pseudoscience designed to bolster white people who control all these institutions that love to consume this material that says, oh yes, we're the greatest people ever, and diminish the achievements of other groups. And this pseudoscience corrupts government and education, even religion. Later, and even policing. Cesare Lombroso goes on measuring faces and bodies and even feet, odd thing, saying that there are criminal groups, that certain ethnicities are more prone to criminality. The common thread here is a white superiority. So much so that when Paul Broca, when measuring skulls, found that in an area of Africa, they had bigger skulls and thus then bigger brains than Northern Europeans, he actually changed his data. He actively changed his data so that there wouldn't be anybody with as big as heads and as big as brains as Northern Europeans, thus then smart. Now, some people say, it doesn't really have any impact on me. Why do I care about this? Well, the next step after craniometry is pretty much disposed of, then you see the development and use of the IQ test, a guy named Binet and another guy named Goddard. Both are Binet's looking into French use in schools, identifying those that might be feeble-minded. Goddard is a guy here in America, also very much focused on finding the feeble-minded. Another guy named Terman, Terman. They feed into this eugenics idea, and it has a lot of extremely negative impacts for groups. Because white people believe in the inferiority, and the IQ test is telling them, see, they're inferior, we have sterilization of people that have physical and mental disabilities, and groups of people against their knowledge, Native Americans, Puerto Ricans, um, and a deeply ingrained systemic racism against those groups, with white people on the top, all other groups below them. Finally, there's a guy named C.C. Brigham that the book discusses, a ardent racist, believing very much that Negroes were inferior. He develops a little test that may have had an impact or might have an impact on your life, called the SAT. So in the 1920s and 30s, he's using the enthusiasm for the IQ test. Very enthusiastic in the Army. They wanted to sort people out. And then that was also, those tests were then applied to new immigrants, trying to weed out the bad immigrants. By the way, these were all European immigrants. People from Eastern and Southern Europe were considered to be somehow inferior. And that this person who's feeding very much into racism and eugenics develops this little test called the SAT, and it's still being used today. Now, it's not my assertion that it's as racist as it was, but the fact is that when we look at these tests, these IQ tests, we see this replication of racism. Who designs the test? Middle class, middle-aged, white men with above, 13 years of schooling. Who does best on these tests? Middle class, middle-aged, white men with above 13 years of schooling. So that is one of the assertions about how something like science, and education, and government, and even religion go hand in hand to disadvantage a group. Now, we're going to move to the Our Lives book. We start here in this book with slavery and the slave trade. We're going to talk about that probably in the next video, about why it is that, again, with thousands of years of culture, even here in our book, we start with African and then later African Americans starting with the slave trade. It moves on to Bacon's Rebellion. Know that as a class rebellion with racial tension embedded. Know about the slave codes in Virginia, that slavery would be forever. The Stono Rebellion. And again, here, one of the little sidebars is Native Americans actually went out and harbored slaves. You see all these movies where Native Americans are saving white people. Actually, they often would exchange hospitality and try to harbor slaves because they understood that the white folks weren't on either one of their side. Benjamin Banneker, read about him. Know what the 3/5 clause is. Know also that the Bible is used in several places to okay the use of slavery. First of all, if you're a student at all of the Bible, then you know that slavery from beginning to end is mentioned. It is not condemned. It is mentioned very much in the same way you would mention anything that you basically accept. In fact, actually, often during this time, there was something called the Mark of Ham. One of Noah's children commits a transgression and then is him and his descendants are identified as the Mark of Ham, and that you can enslave them. And then people at the time go, the Mark of Ham's got to be darker skin. So if we find anyone darker skin, we can enslave them. No, William Lloyd Garrison, abolitionist and newspaper person. No, Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and Frederick Douglass. No, the Dred Scott decision, and the idea that after that decision, he was considered property. Juneteenth, KKK, Plessy versus Ferguson, that's where we get separate but equal. Lynching, we're going to come back to that in more depth. The Harlem Renaissance, the Tulsa Massacre, what redlining is, we've talked about that. Brown versus Board, the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, the Watts riots, and the Black Lives Matter demonstrations. Now, the magic word for today, Harriet Tubman is our secret word for this lecture, Harriet Tubman. And now we're going to move on to discussing the video that you're supposed to watch about the Black Panthers. Again, as you're reading that, know the founders, Bobby Seale, Huey Newton, and eventually Eldridge Cleaver know what COINTELPRO or COINTELPRO by the FBI is. Know the programs that they started. Know that Bobby Seale was part of the Chicago 8. That there really was a conspiracy by the Nixon administration to identify and put down, with the help of Herbert Hoover, African Americans that were trying to push against the system. Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., and the Panthers were all identified, all tracked, surveilled illegally, arrested, beaten, shot. Fred Hampton in Chicago was killed in his bed by 14 cops while he was asleep. It's just straight up assassinated. So read that. Watch that. Make sure you make some notes about that, making sure you cover those issues there. And here's where we pause for Lecture 7A.